Hello, everybody. If you're in the UK, good afternoon. If you're elsewhere, hi, welcome. So today, we're really happy to kick off CfHAS 2022 seminar series. We have 6 talks lined up every sort of 2 months or so. So we have another talk. Our next talk is in April, and we have one in June, and then we kind of break for the summer, and then I think September, October, and November. And you can check out the full schedule via our website. So today we're going to kick off. I'm very happy to say that Matt Adams from the University of Brighton is our first speaker. And I will just say a few things about Matt. If I can get to the right screen. Okay. So Matt Adams is a principal lecturer in psychology in the School of Humanities and Social Science at the University of Brighton. His writing and research is interdisciplinary, and in recent years has become increasingly focused on the experiential and interpersonal dynamics of human-animal relations in particular, and human-non-human nature relations more broadly, especially in the context of the Anthropocene. And I just wanted to also mention that Matt has a relatively recent book out as well, and it's called Anthropocene Psychology, Being Human in a More Than Human World. So please do check that out. And also, you might just want to check out Matt's research page as well. It's very, I found it very enjoyable to go through his list of publications and just to realize the breadth of work that he's done over the, in past 10 to 20 years, really. So I definitely recommend that you do that. Okay, so I will hand over to Matt, and Matt, if you could also just start by telling everybody the title of the presentation as well, just in case you've done any changes to it since we had the formal title. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks for that, Richard. I haven't changed the title. I've got some slides. Can I share the screen? Is that something I can do? Let's try. But I'm not the host, so my screen sharing is disabled, apparently.
You should be able to share now, Matt. Can you just
try? Thank you. Yeah, now I can. Perfect. So let's try. I'll just put this on a. Okay, so can you all see the slides and the title?
Yes.
Yes.
It's good.
Yes. Oh, good. Yeah. So thanks for that very warm invitation, and thank you for taking the time out to listen to me today. Looks like a great series of talks. So it's a real pleasure to kick this off. Yeah, Pavlov and the Kingdom of Dogs: Telling Different Human-Animal Stories is the title I put together for this one, and an abstract, which I've just had a quick look at and still kind of reflects what I want to talk about today. So that's a good thing, right? A little bit of background I thought would be helpful, where I'm coming from. I guess I've come to know about animals and human-animal relations initially through the work of Donna Haraway, through a backstory that I won't go into, and alongside Donna Haraway, Vinciane Desprez, as philosophers who creatively, really enjoyably, critically framing human and more than human relationships in the context of the Anthropocene, broadly speaking, which was something I was already interested in. But coming from a background and still teaching in psychology, I found there to be a lot of space in psychology still for this kind of thinking. There are exceptions. There are people like Kenneth Shapiro working in psychology specifically already. But when we do start to kind of enter the space of psychology with the lens of human-animal relations, if you like, lots of interesting questions come up. That's what I found anyway. And so I've shifted from trying to engage psychology with the animal turn more broadly, I suppose, moving between kind of theoretical engagement and more empirical work. Yeah, I've moved back and forward, but I've noticed that animals are rarely recognized as subjects with a voice, as involved in interpersonal relationships in psychology with a capital P, the discipline. So since then, I focus more and more on human-animal relations in my research and teaching. Now, for this focus, I should point out I'm not a historian. I've not studied history or the history of sciences, but I'm venturing into something like animal history, which, as Susan Nance said, is a methodologically and politically challenging type of historical research at the best of times. So I'm an indebted beginner, not least to the work of Daniel Toads, Professor of History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University, but also a biographer of Pavlov. He's done a remarkable in-depth biography of Pavlov, which I draw on significantly here. So yeah, Pavlov. Why have I chosen Pavlov? A few reasons, I think. Partly is his prominence. He still features heavily in psychology's narrative. He's one of the most visible figures in psychology's history, in psychology timeline still, if you like. He appears in every single undergraduate textbook. That figure on the left there is the 9th most cited psychologist in current introductory psychology textbooks. And he still features prominently in the minds, if you like, of psychologists, particularly in the US, which still dominates psychology. So he's 6th behind in the most cited survey of American psychologists. Who's behind him? Allmen, Bandura, Watson, Freud, Piaget, and Skinner. Skinner was first, who's indebted to Pavlov as well. And we also have, sorry, I'm just trying to get my own image out of the way here. 24th in the composite ranking of 100 most eminent psychologists of the 20th century, Pavlov is. So yeah, remains to this day one of the most cited psychologists of all times. But he appeals also, in the context of my interest in animal studies, as a potential focal point because, of course, I'm assuming we know this, he researched on in terms of looking at Pavlov and Pavlov's oeuvre through an animal studies lens. So I want to start really by talking about this kind of usual story of Pavlov, where the focus is usually him as a person and his methods. All images here, I should say, actually, are from the Wellcome collection, kind of museum and archive of artifacts broadly related to science and medicine and health. And this is one of Ivan Pavlov. There he is at the bottom with a fulsome beard, demonstrating an experiment on a dog in an amphitheatre of the physiological laboratory around early 1900. And everyone's wearing uniforms because he was doing this at the Military Medical Academy in St. Petersburg, where most of his work was carried out. So Pavlov was a physiologist turned psychologist. Most of us have heard of him. He's famous for his discovery, in particular, of classical conditioning, experimenting with dogs. Basically, maybe I'll give a bit more detail of this later. Many of you will know he repeatedly paired different stimuli, such as a ticking metronome, with the presentation of food to a dog. And he found that dogs eventually salivated to the sound of the metronome on its own, salivating more or less to the same quantity as when previously twinned with food. So this deceptively simple discovery of learning through association then revolutionized psychology, kickstarted one of the most important and controversial schools of thought in the discipline of psychology, behaviorism. So this is why we get quotes like this that are on the slide there about classical conditioning experiments. Every student of psychology learns about classical conditioning. And of course, a Pavlovian response, that term has entered into the English language to refer to the prevalence of this type of learning in everyday life. So I said I was going to tell you a little bit about the kind of dominant story of how Pavlov's represented. And this is a good example, this quote here, classical conditioning being the main focus in textbook coverage, along with associated terminology. This is where undergraduate students, same for popular psychology texts actually, is where we might first encounter Pavlov and his dogs, probably where many of us might only encounter them. Interesting that this one's got it all wrong. In fact, Pavlov received a Nobel Prize for some earlier work, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, not dogs' salivation at food, and apparently never used a bell. Anyway, it wasn't just sounds, it was sights, tastes, touch, smells, all sorts of stimuli. So this tends to be the focus of representations. And if I show you one more slide, I bet for many of you this is familiar, in accompanying kind of descriptions in textbooks and so on. I've taken this from countless textbooks and popular texts, but they're all pretty much the same, aren't they? It's all about the terminology, which I won't go into, about unconditional stimuli, conditional stimuli, and so on. What's interesting to me is how the dogs are represented here. They're 2D, they're uniform, interchangeable. They're more or less just part of the mechanism. They feature as objects in the service of recounting Pavlov's experimental method. Part of this clamour for scientific credibility of psychology, particularly earlier 20th century, but still going on today, is this ability to represent the facts of psychology in these kinds of equations and diagrams. So yeah, dogs appear interchangeable in these. And in the descriptions that go with them, these recent textbook and also passing accounts to Pavlov's work in physiology and psychology, it's Pavlov's achievements that carry all before them. The dogs appear as matters of facts, conduits, if you like, for knowledge development and kind of progressive teleology as psychology as a science. So I like this first quote here because it's very scientific, isn't it? Hard set laws derived from Ivan Pavlov's studies of animals. Predictability, this is what it's all about, modifiable reflexes. Really important in the development of psychology as a science, this idea that behavior can be broken down in this way. In fact, it became possible not to mention dogs at all in the establishment of classical conditioning. The second quote there manages to do that. CfHAS reiterates this kind of mechanistic portrayal of Pavlovian conditioning, whilst never mentioning dogs at all. Common practice in many extensions, overviews, and appraisals of Pavlov's work. I kept surprising myself. So, for example, the 700+ page Handbook of Operant and Classical Conditioning by McSweeney and Murphy mentions only once that dogs were used as subjects in Pavlov's experiments. So the point being here is that the role of dogs as living animals rarely features in accounts of Pavlov's contribution to psychology. When they are mentioned, the emphasis goes back to Pavlov, and he is championed for his surgical technique, as he is on the left here. Often he was an ambidextrous surgeon, and for kind of second-hand accounts of the care that Pavlov apparently invested in post-operative settings, overriding concern for kind of comfortable recovery of his dogs, a real cozy image of Pavlov's method engendering normal and happy, healthy dogs. And if we look at biographies and contemporaneous accounts, Pavlov was certainly keen on offering that discourse himself. And he presented his own dogs as happy, energetic, long-lived, and so on. So what we're left with from common representations today is a picture of order, predictability, rigor, care, in which dogs are, on the whole, though, kind of backgrounded as barely mentioned experimental objects, definitely nothing for us to worry about. To reiterate, very little account is given of the canine involvement in experiments themselves. No description in any of these texts academic, undergraduate, popular, of the conditions in which the dogs were kept, their lives in detail, the detail of the procedures, in fact, beyond evasively rudimentary descriptions. So my intention was then to kind of dig a little bit deeper, try and listen to what the dogs were saying, metaphorically speaking, as subjects rather than assuming them to be objects, trying to place Pavlov's dogs in the spotlight a little bit more. And yeah, as I said, I still constantly surprised by how much more there was to this story. And through biographies, journalism, historical sources, and related texts that I'm only just becoming familiar with, it quickly became clear that there's another story to tell in which dogs have more say. In fact, I've included a street scene from St. Petersburg in the 1880s here for a reason. By a zoocentric twist of fate, the story really begins, if I want to do a different kind of biography, if you like, that doesn't focus on, say, Pavlov's early years. The story really begins with a rabid dog running loose on the streets of St. Petersburg in 1885, as recounted by Daniel Todes, that biographer I mentioned earlier. The dog, a setter named Pluto, bites the arm of a passing soldier, Alex. His commanding officer turns out to be nobility, Prince Oldenbursky, I refer to him as Prince O, an extremely wealthy friend and distant cousin of the Tsar at the time, Alexander. An eccentric modernizer, this prince, and an avid convert to the progress and potential of scientific medicine at the time. So what does Prince O do? He packs Alex off to Louis Pasteur's lab in Paris, where he's just announced with great fanfare a rabies vaccine. Alex returns cured. Prince O impulsively funds Russia's first institution dedicated to medical research based on Pasteur's teaching in St. Petersburg. And because Prince O is unconventional and impetuous himself, he plucks someone who was down on his luck, who was struggling, a tarnished reputation for various reasons I won't go into, but who was a skilled physiologist and surgeon. That person, of course, was Pavlov, and he placed him at the helm of this new institution. So overnight, Pavlov is catapulted to the chief of Russia's biggest and most modern physiology laboratory, all thanks to a dog. We don't know what happened to Pluto. Up until then, Pavlov was really struggling. He was impoverished, teaching and demonstrating to make ends meet. He'd had at least one breakdown. He was often experimenting on animals in his flat because he considered that a safer and more hygienic practice than the labs that were available to him. So all things change. This artwork is a physiological demonstration with the vivisection of a dog from 1832 by Emile Edouard Mucci. From the heyday of 19th century physiology, especially the Frenchman Francois Magendel and Claude Bernard, vivisection was king. And when Pavlov studied sciences at St. Petersburg and honed in on physiology, late 19th century, live vivisection was just completely the norm in animal experimentation, strongly justified and rationalized by the pursuit of scientific knowledge, as it is in this quote here, blind to the blood that flows. Now, Pavlov wasn't opposed to vivisection in any ethical sense, really. He used it as a method in his own PhD studies. However, from his early training, he developed a strong preference for an alternative, what he called chronic experiments, in contrast to acute experiments, vivisection. And as soon as he had some authority and resources, which he now had, he set about pursuing chronic experiments in his new role, alongside a real strong desire to reform lab practice. This is an image from a basement in the physiology department at the Imperial Institute of Experimental Medicine, where Pavlov worked in St. Petersburg, featuring a couple of animal keepers. So Pavlov's fascinated now by lab procedure and technology. He's taken in by Lister's radical approach to antiseptic surgery, is a convert to that. Still lots of skeptics in and around Pavlov, including the clinical head at one of the academies Pavlov worked at, who, again, I'm quoting Todes here, whom ridiculed Pavlov's fear of invisible bacteria. which was still not the norm to accept this. And to emphasize the point, demonstratively put a finger he had just employed in the rectal exam of one patient into the mouth of another. So these were new developments. And even with Pavlov's reforms, look at the state of this place in the photo. They're still far from the kind of white, sterile laboratories that we might imagine today. So at this stage in his career, Pavlov was a physiologist. He was interested in the relationship between eating and variation in the secretion of gastric, pancreatic, and salivary fluids. And for these studies, Pavlov was insistent on trying to keep the dogs alive. He thought that was a better way to test and discover practices of a living animal than it was to study one that was in the process of dying. So he tried to keep them alive and functioning normally as much as possible. And plenty of accounts in physiology publications then and now recount his approach to this, the chronic experiments. Let's go into a little bit more detail. We're certainly mistaken if we think that these experiments were somehow unequivocally humane or caring. In fact, the dogs involved in these experiments were often in pain, often chronic pain, often terminal, and they clearly suffered on the experimenter stand. For example, the sham feeding system, which is depicted here. I'll quote an original description to give you a sense of this. Pavlov would remove a dog's esophagus and create an opening, a fistula, in the animal's throat, so that no matter how much the dog ate, the food would fall out and never make it to the stomach. By creating additional fistulas along the digestive system and collecting the various secretions, he could measure their quantity, properties in great detail. And we have quotes from Pavlov saying, "Our passionate desire to extend experimental trials on such a rare animal, one that lived with a fistula for 10 days, that was seen as rare, was foiled by its death as a result of extended starvation." Because this is what was happening to these dogs. They were effectively starving, and a series of wounds. The passionate desire here then is not for welfare, but for good science. Many dogs are sacrificed along the way just in developing these techniques. Operating techniques routinely failed. New developments often increased Pavlov's fervor. Again, to quote him, cited in Toads this time, "I'm trying and will now shred dogs without mercy. You know I have not worked so hard for a long time." In refining another procedure, Pavlov states that 30 dogs were sacrificed in vain. However, throughout his career, Pavlov publicly talked up his approach to animal experimentation as scientifically superior and regularly made statements that his dogs were happy and healthy. As we've seen, this is a claim commonly repeated, and this was a contemporaneous newspaper coverage at the time on the slide there. As the biographer Toad sums up with characteristic understatement, the relative normalcy of these dogs remained a matter of interpretation. But things change. And my intention here isn't just to kind of damn Pavlov retrospectively. In the course of studying the physiological mechanisms of salivation described just a minute ago, dogs were regularly fed whilst on the experimenter stand and their saliva measured. At some point, Pavlov and his staff noticed the dogs salivating prematurely in anticipating food, often in response to the environmental cues that normally preempted feeding. Now, this wasn't a surprise in itself, but what Pavlov started to realize that he couldn't explain away what he termed these psychic secretions. And he and his staff became increasingly interested in them, eventually actually turning more or less the whole of his laboratory resources to the study of conditional reflexes, classical conditioning, what we refer to as it today. Now, whilst many of the stimuli used were unpleasant, say the place of sand in a dog's mouth or stones, or sometimes electrocution, the measurement of salivation depended on a surgical procedure that was relatively unobtrusive compared to his early research. The insertion of one or more fistulas into a dog's cheek or neck to divert saliva from one of the 3 salivary glands into a measuring device. So what this means for me is significant. It's intriguing from a human animal or animal studies perspective, as it suggests the possibility of more numerous, closer, and qualitatively different encounters between experimenters and dogs on grounds less easily defined or less readily defined by experiences of violence and suffering, especially as it became the norm in the early 20th century for each co-worker to be assigned their own dog for the duration of their studies. It's one of my favorite pictures, dogs with their keepers at the physiology department in the Imperial Institute, St. Petersburg, being walked in the grounds. By the early 1900s, Pavlov and dozens of co-workers, human and non-human, across 3 lab sites by now in St. Petersburg, embarked on the systematic, more or less exclusive study of saliva drops and what were now termed conditional reflexes via thousands of chronic experimental trials involving all sorts of stimuli. At the same time, Pavlov was running a gastric juice factory, which was going strong throughout much of Pavlov's career. By its peak in around late 1920s, these were separate factory dogs still in the same complex who were put to work to produce 4,500 litres of gastric juice from their stomachs. It was extracted, bottled, marketed, and distributed as a cure for dyspepsia, for indigestion in humans, and helped to fund Pavlov's work. So, thousands of dogs passing through Pavlov's labs throughout his career. No wonder a visitor to his laboratory in the early 20th century named it the Kingdom of Dogs. Now, of course, it's hard to say historically what it was like for dogs. I guess a starting point is we can look at photographs like this, but we might want to think about where they came from. Again, it's not always clear. A quote attributed to Pavlov and re-quoted a few times says that dogs were collected with the help of street thieves who used to steal those with collars as well as those without. No doubt we shared the onus of the sin with the thieves. So dogs were collected from the streets and will have had all sorts of previous experiences, a range of previous experiences. Accounts of the use of dogs in the late 19th and early 20th century medical lab research suggests that this is common, and it's partly motivated by the large availability of stray and unwanted dogs on urban streets. It doesn't seem to warrant much further explanation in lots of physiology write-ups of research that the dogs were taken from the streets. Dogs' experiences change. I won't go into detail today. In parallel with kind of Pavlov's standing, he rose and fell and rose again. But by the late 1920s, when Stalin was fully behind his work, he could have much more say and much more money in terms of where the dogs came from, where they were obtained from. So a shifting dynamic. We can say a few things, I think, venture a few ideas about life in the labs. Even a brief survey of what we know now, what it's like to be a dog, even acknowledging the ontological impossibility of doing so, suggests the experimenter stand must have been at best a profoundly strange situation for dogs. At least partially defined by regular encounters with humans, handlers, experimenters. Human-canine interaction, ethnography tells us, is always a spatially situated activity. After surgery, they took part in countless conditioning experiments. Their lives involved trips to and from the stand, but also in the vivarium, the animal house, in the lab complex, in the grounds. We now, of course, point to the vividness of dogs' experience, of emotions keenly felt, of dogs as receptive, expressive, empathic communicators, capable of complex forms of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. So we can begin to read experiences of Pavlov's dogs through an animal studies lens, I think. For example, Donna Haraway approaches domestic human-animal encounters, as she calls them, including laboratory work, as relational configurations through which both human and animal mutually constitute and transform each other. In describing the complexity and dynamism of human-canine interrelationships in this context, and particularly dog agility work, which Haraway engaged in herself and spoke about a lot, She uses the evocative phrase, a subject transforming dance, to try and capture how over time shared practices transform both dog and human. A point she extends and elaborates on compellingly in describing her own experiences. But can we really say the same about life on the experimenter stand? Someone else's work who's really influenced my thinking about this is Linda Burke, and this is what she says about experimental animals. Lab experiments tend to rest on creating animals as objects whose experiences are considered important. Lab animals are seldom seen as animals. They tend to exist as numbers, as tools of the trade. And to some extent, I think we can agree with that in terms of representation, but less so, I think, the more we look with Lichtenstein and Berlecki's claim here that in Pavlovian conditioning, the animal actually remains passive in an essential sense. The scholarship of Toads and others reveals that in practice, this wasn't the case. In fact, even within the confines of the lab, even on the experimenter stand, Pavlov's dogs were not passive. Even if they are, of course, as Haraway describes relationships, significantly unfree partners in this relationship. Even if their life is constructed in part by the lab, even if we must acknowledge power asymmetries, which we always must. If we, following Haraway, I'm just going to quote her here, approach human entanglements as face-to-face, in the company of significant others, companion species to one another. If we do so, then the labor in this space of encounter for both dog and human was constraining. It was monotonous. It was wearisome. It demanded patience and forbearance on both parts. But returning to dogs, we can certainly question this notion of predictability and passivity. This is a particularly grim picture of the vivarium, Animal House, 1904, I think, in the physiology department at St. Petersburg. So in practice, Pavlov's dogs were not docile and passive conditioned reflex machines. I've used the word resistance here, and accounts reveal that at times dogs were far from passive. Resistance was literal and active. They were often stubborn in refusing food or other inducements. They bridled at specific stimuli. They expressed hostility towards some co-workers or unfamiliar visitors. Sometimes they refused point blank to enter particular spaces. And so there's lots of documentation in Pavlov's co-workers' accounts, many of which Toads has translated or got access to, that talk about this resistance. Pavlov's dogs were also involved in a more subtle and yet pervasive resistance to Pavlov's carefully constructed theoretical edifice. I've used 2 or 3 terms here that help capture that. So despite this apparent discovery of regularity in classical conditioning, order, hard set laws that we've seen, even the most simple and basic patterns in the way conditioned responses worked were actually subject to a great deal of variation and complexity. Now, Pavlov was profoundly troubled by this, the simple fact that different dogs responded to the same conditioned stimuli in different ways, in terms of how much they salivated or when. Some conditioned responses were reinforced much more quickly in some dogs or some breeds compared to others, just as the same dogs responded differently on different days, however much Pavlov tried to control his variables. This was a fact well known by Pavlov and his co-workers, but actively erased from academic publications and public pronouncements. It was maintained as what Toads refers to as an industrial secret. But Pavlov did try and address this variation, and it required interpretive moments. More experiments, more complex theoretical models were required to try and keep up. These moments became established in the experimental protocol over the years. In fact, co-workers were increasingly encouraged to attend to these idiosyncrasies in dogs' behavior on and off the stand. A column became part of the process of documentation called other observation. And alongside measuring stimuli, response types, timings, this final column, the co-worker was allowed to remark on a dog's reactions to the demands of an experiment in terms of character. weak or strong, compliant or independent, passive or impressionable. And this was because well into the 1920s, Pavlov was trying to develop a theory of a dog's nervous types. So by coming up with a theory of, let's say, 3 or 4 nervous types, he could try and explain away differences in conditioning. The problem was that he had to shift from 2 to 5 to 10 to 30 different personality types trying to explain this difference. And still, he couldn't come up with a coherent theory. It also provided a theoretical framework and legitimation for some of his more horrifying work in terms of canine welfare, lab experiments conducted in the Tower of Silence, pictured here, which I won't report on here because I've got a feeling I'm running out of time. But yes. So back to an animal studies framework, paying closer attention, what does that do? It further unsettles received representations in which the experimenter, the animal, the apparatus, all have their carefully designated place in an experimental assemblage, supposedly revealing higher mechanistic, universal psychological processes. What it does reveal instead is the messy, entangled nature of human-animal relations, right at the core of Pavlov's research. Industrial secrets, interpretive moments, ever-expanding personality typologies, they all point to the liveliness, the unpredictability of the dogs on and off the experimenter stand. In relation with Pavlov's co-workers. The active engagement of the dogs in expressing their own needs, their desires, their discomfiture. So whilst dogs were significantly unfree partners, to use Haraway's term again, in the relational configurations of the lab, we are right to follow Haraway in avoiding absolute categories of freedom versus unfreedom, and to instead be drawn to the metaphor of degrees of freedom, which always, to quote Haraway again, allow for unfilled space, something outside of calculation that can still happen. I think that really captures what was going on in Pavlov's labs aptly. So whereas Vinciane Desprez says, in these kinds of setups, the system fully articulates the animal, I would argue that no, the system cannot ever fully articulate the animal. The animal still managed to exceed that system. And these interactions, and encounters in which animals are active participants are also political on many levels. Animals and relations they are entangled in playing a really active role here. In this case, they're at the heart of Pavlov's experimental assemblage. They contribute to his ascendancy, to the positioning of Soviet and global science in the 20th century, and of psychology's attempt to present itself as a genuine science, beholden to the experimental method. All sorts of political and cultural ramifications there are still being played out. The same can be said for the centrality of behaviorism in psychology in early to mid 20th century. Yeah, I don't think I've got time to talk about kind of the wider events in St. Petersburg as well. I'll save those for another day, but I just want to say a couple more things about why this matters to me still. The portrait of Pavlov's dogs that emerges from this kind of discussion stands in stark contrast to the standard one still found in psychological literature, where dogs are made visible only as disembodied stimulus response conduits, saliva-producing apparatus. So we're challenging what is still a common reading, a cultural shorthand in psychology. Those kind of power relations are inscribed in these texts, and I think that's really important to try and challenge those. In closing their critical review of Zimbardo's infamous prison studies, informed by newly available archive materials, Riker and colleagues conclude that there is no longer any excuse for repeating a story which is so deeply flawed. We need to get busy rewriting our texts and revisiting our lectures. The same, I think, can be said of Pavlov and his dogs, particularly in the context of animal studies. It's about challenging these models on an ethical, theoretical, political front. More widely, I think a rewrite has wider implications for the discipline of psychology. It invites a radical widening of the scope of who and what matters in psychology beyond the species boundary. It can contribute to wider discourses of animal studies and to politics that problematizes the positioning of animals. It's about how we represent and conceptualize animals, including laboratory animals, in text, imagery, and so on. It's about the culture of laboratory animals today and processes in psychology. And fundamentally for me, it begins with interests, the interests of animals, which is a political question. So yeah, where do I want to go with this next? I wanted to finish with this. I want to dig deeper and I want to explore different ways to tell lab animal stories. I recently submitted a proposal to work with arts-based practitioners and storytellers to create a diorama of Pavlov's St. Petersburg laboratory complex and create a graphic novel. And I think these are really interesting and important ways of drawing attention to these issues in different ways and for different audiences. So yeah, I wanted to finish by reproducing the names of Pavlovs dogs that I've drew together from different sources so far, which I included as an attachment in a recent paper. But other than that, I think I've said enough. So yeah, there's some references on the slides at the end, which I'll try and make available. But otherwise, thank you for listening. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's a really nice way to end with the list of the dogs' names.
Yeah, just stop sharing there. Thanks, Richard.
Yeah. Please imagine lots of virtual applause at this point in time. Yeah, there's a few people putting their, their hands up.
Amazing, thank you, yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so we're now in our time zone, we're at 4:45. Please, if you'd like to ask a question, then don't use the applause, but use the other icon to the raised hand icon, and then we can go to some Q&A and some comments, or you could use the chat function as well, I think. And feel free to turn on your cameras at this point, but maybe remain muted unless you're asking a question.
Richard, you've got Anastasia.
I can't see that. Thank you.
Up.
Yeah, Anastasia, thanks. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm from Russia, and I'm studying animals in Russian history, particularly in cities. And my PhD is dedicated to the animals in the social and cultural life of Russian cities. So I try to present Russian capital cities as anthrozoic cities where people and animals did live together. And that's why I'd like to make a small remark on this, on this topic where those dogs were coming from. So what I think is that, that those types of dogs that are presented there on those photos from the archives, they look like hunting dogs, types of various hunting packs. And what I think, in those times, the institution of pet keeping was just emerging, and there were not many pet animals which were living actually inside the house. They were quite rare, and this is a type of animals which I am exploring now. But so I think that those dogs, they look like those dogs were just hunting dogs, are just regular dogs. And those regular dogs, they usually lived just in the yards somewhere around the house. And if they usually were not leashed. And I was very surprised to see the leashes on this in that photo of the lab, because during my studies I just discovered that nobody used leashes at those times. No leashes, nothing. They were dogs were just roaming throughout the city, and that's why anything could happen to them anytime. And people didn't seem to be concerned very much about this. So even if a pet animal was lost, the person usually was sad about this, but this person could just replace this pet easily. Nevertheless, they considered those pets as even friends and even family members. So there was with the pet animal, they had definitely had this psycho-emotional attachment, but not for those dogs which were on the street.
Wow, thank you. It's fascinating, Anastasia. Yeah, that's some of the gaps I need to fill in. There's the odd moment like where Lenin sends someone to meet Pavlov to ask him what he needs, and he's promised that dogs can be procured, don't worry about it, en masse, and there's no more. It's like, how did they do that? How could they make that promise? Where do they come from? And there's so many, so, it'd be great to fill in those gaps. Things change later in his career. He gets more access to facilities where dogs can be bred, which certainly didn't happen earlier in his career and only became a possibility, I think, in the early 1930s, in fact. But up until then, they were procured from somewhere. So yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting to try and start to fill in those details about what the attitudes were to street dogs, how many there were. I mean, apparently their life expectancy on the street in the early 1900s was around 4 to 5 years. So, that's tells us something about how it's not just, we have to compare and think about the dogs' lives on the streets compared to what it would be in the lab, and it's not the same as dogs' lives are today. They vary in time just like humans do. So thank you. Yeah, that's really already some real insight into.
Can I add a little, if it's possible? As for, Prince Olderbrunsky was very, very rich person. He could have, and I'm pretty sure he had his own hunting estates, and he just could use these extra dogs. Nobody cared, those dogs, or they were considered like packs, not like the individual dog. And as actually, I'm pretty sure that there was a process when a hunting dog from a pack can become a pet animal, a family member. This was a process how this institution of pet animals in Russia emerged and established, as I think. But and as for after the revolution of 1917, I guess that's what happened. That pet this institution of pet just was like cancelled. There were nobody had the money for that. So because pet animal is just a very expensive and kind of luxurious thing, luxurious part of luxury, for luxury lifestyle, and only a very wealthy and noble part of Russian society were able to have those pet animals. That's why after the revolution, those pets, they just disappeared. They just died out, and and also those hunting packs, of course, they were considered by the communists like like something that was the feature of this noble, which they hated. And that's why those packs and those estates where hunting dogs were bred, they were they closed, and the hunt itself just it was the communists, they were looking at it like it was something, of course, from the past life. It's from the imperial life. So I guess, so I guess there were a lot of dogs right after the revolution. So Pavlov can just use, could just use anything.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for filling in some of those gaps.
Thank you, Anastasia. That's a really valuable contribution. We have lots of questions now. Fantastic. I think Amy was next. Amy Nelson.
Hi, Matt, thanks for this wonderful talk. I was so delighted when it came across my Twitter feed a few weeks ago and have really enjoyed our back and forth since. I feel like Pavlov's Dogs have waited a long time for you, so I'm grateful to you for taking this up. So I'm in the United States. I teach Soviet history at Virginia Tech, and I work on space dogs. And I guess I have just a question and a comment. And my question is, in kind of looking at the experience of Pavlov's dogs and kind of writing them into the history of psychology, where does an ethological lens kind of fit, right? So, you know, it's something I've thought a lot about myself, right? That Haraway and Dupre, Haraway gets us so far. Dupre is an additional sort of step, but it feels like that next step is an ethological perspective, given what we know about dogs' cognitive capacities and how dogs make their way in the world. So I'm just wondering, like, how you sort of see that unfolding going forward. And then the other thing is, I love the graphic novel, and it's striking to me that it's got some resonances with Nick Abadzis's amazing book called about Laika, like the palette and the graphics. So so that's just kind of a cool serendipitous thing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll respond to the second first. I love that book. And yeah, I'd love to get the opportunity to do something that in any way lives up to what he managed to do there, because he, the dogs didn't speak in his novel, which you can do, is an option, obviously. But they were so expressive and they were such a major part of the story that I just thought he did a brilliant job. Yeah, but in terms of ethology, yeah, it's difficult with historical cases. I'm not a historian, but to kind of go back and read into dog sentience and the detail of dogs' lives in that period, I found really hard not to impose. I mean, it's impossible to do anything other than to impose kind of my own interpretation on what was going on and create a really general representation of dogs' lives then. I just don't seem to, so far, I don't speak Russian, be able to access that fine-grained level of detail to say that much, other than then step back again and use an animal studies lens to try and think about the dogs as part of a wider assemblage and insert them back into that. And see that they are then part of, they need to be considered ethically and politically as contributing to psychology then and now. There's still a great deal of practice today that I'm only just coming to terms with in, say, neurocognitive psychology that describes animals in a really similar way, that backgrounds them. And it's very unclear to start with the kind of processes and procedures, often surgical, that are involved that take some deciphering. So yeah, there is a disconnect though for me with that historical work to get that level of detail.
Thank you. I think we have the next question from Ken Shapiro. Good to see you, Ken.
Yes, hi. Thank you for that, Matt. Yeah, I'm really interested in your presentation. Certainly the whole idea, the reductionistic kind of approach to animals is so accentuated in the laboratory animal setting. A couple of threads I just wanted to throw you away that you might want to follow. One has to do with the sham feeding procedure.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if Pavlov originated that, but anyway, it was picked up much later in the study of eating disorders. And that sham feeding procedure with rats and dogs became a model for bulimia, and so that you could check on
Mm-hmm.
non-nutritive feeding which is then mimics bulimia, throwing up after eating. So in some ways, it promoted, if indeed it was picked up from Pavlov, it promoted a more invasive kind of procedure. And I criticize that eating disorder model on the basis of the lack of citations of it in the literature. So the eating disorder clinical people have not learned from that. The other thread has to do with his quote unquote discovery of individual differences in the dogs. And in the early 20th century, there was a considerable tension within the field of psychology over what Gordon Allport called nomothetic versus idiographic approaches, where the nomothetic was the general law that applied to all behavior, and the idiographic was more respectful of individuals and individual differences. And I don't know how much that was influential, but certainly in the general history of psychology, the idiographic lost ground. It's been picked up more recently. Of course, Jung was very much into that with introversion and extroversion and so forth. And then we also found some literature on temperament differences that were constitutional, which were the basis for individual differences. But Sam Gosling has recently done research on personality differences in animals. The idea that animals have personality and therefore they have subjectivity and they have a life that's influenced both not only by their species breed, but also by their history and biography. So anyway, that's a couple of lines I thought you might find of interest to follow.
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth. I appreciate that. Yeah, there's not much to respond other than yes, I will follow them up. But yes, certainly Pavlov was developing a theory of nervous types, and he really tried to marry that with his conditioning experiments throughout his later career. It's just that in the retellings subsequently, the personality theory, because he never managed to make it cohere, fell away. And instead there was this focus on these hard set laws, and then behaviorism, of course, took that on and ignored personality types effectively for a long time, and just said that took that side of Pavlov's work, which actually, as I've said, was more complex. But anyway, and said it's much more about conditioning and the environment. We don't need to worry about the black box personalities so much. So, but yes, it's definitely, I'll definitely follow those up. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Eva Marie has a question.
Yes, hang on. Hi. So thank you so much for this, Matt. For me, it was really interesting since I'm doing a PhD right now. I'm in the final stages, and I'm actually trying to rewrite art history from the perspective of non-human animals.
Wow.
Yeah. And of course that is, as you say, difficult because I'm human and I'm anthropocentric, and I can never not be that. And I think that's just one of the things that you have to embrace when trying to change these histories or rewrite them or radically imagine them differently. And I think for me, it's been really important to think that all histories are imagined from scraps, because I can hear that you also have these difficulties of how much can I imagine and how to not speak for another, but trying to instead interpret a situation to change this kind of killing of animals system that we're in, right? So I think really think that this idea of doing a graphic novel is great, because I think art is a way through a space to imagine radically different histories, and also to create a space where we can have courage to do that, because we will ultimately fail with our project, but we still have to do it, right? So I'm just very curious in this graphic novel, who will be the narrator, if you have thought anything about ways to write these histories, and or if you already have tried, and what kind of difficulties you have ended up in. So that's just a really personal interest in that I would love to hear you speak on.
Mm. Yeah. Thanks, Eva Marie. That's a great question. I totally agree. I'm excited by the possibilities of art and working with artists because it gives you that license to experiment rather than worrying too hard about how you connect those fragments or whether you can. It's just about using creativity and art to try and tell a story that does connect those fragments, right, in ways which could reach different audiences, yet still trying to adhere to the kind of a principle of animal studies, the principles of it. But yeah, doing it so far, well, what I've done is I've applied to the ChRC for some funding, a research council here in the UK for funding to do it. But to do that, we had to do some research, and I've worked with a couple of illustrators. And one of the first things that happens is those kind of questions that I realized I hadn't really thought through come straight up, you know, like who's going to be the narrator? That's a really big question when you're doing animal studies. You know, and I've had debate with a couple of illustrators, one who we managed to commission to the University of Brighton to do a little bit of work on and imagining what it might look like, which of those images are. But, you know, he thought, no, you can't get the dogs to speak, literally speak, because that would take away from the realism which you need to convey the story. And that was his background. That's fair enough. On the other hand, I was kind of ambivalent about that. I thought, isn't this an opportunity to kind of go into some kind of different world where the animals do speak, maybe in a different font or a different typeface, and we can hear from them, you know, in a more direct way. So I don't know where I would go with that. I think what I've asked for the funding is working with artists collaboratively and illustrators to do this kind of imaginative exercise leading up to the production of a graphic novel, where we draw on animal studies literature to conceptualize it, but also traditions within art and illustration, particularly the representation of animals, to work our way through that. And yet also, you know, the bottom line for me is it's an amazing story. Pavlov's life is an amazing story, but to then turn that around and say, resist it to be a biography of Pavlov, but to focus on the dogs. There are so many moments, you know, in terms of plot, that I just can't wait to get started. I just want someone to give me the money to do it.
So one way for me to go, because I write these art histories where I let some of the portrayed animals in paintings, but also animals hidden in material, to tell their stories, and then I read them for the audience. And I've done this performance things with guided tours and all that kind of stuff. To me, it's been really important to think about these animals as a choir and trying to encompass like several histories in one voice or in one story. And then that kind of solves some of my problems of like, I don't know, some kind of a guilt that comes from the traps of speaking for, you know, that I don't want to do, but I want instead try to interpret. So I like try to think, yeah. So my suggestion is that you try to think of the I as like a more inclusive I, because the I really works as a way to open up empathy. Yeah, so that's just.
I think that could work with Pavlovs Dogs as well. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Eva Marie. Does anybody else have a question for Matt or a comment? I could ask one. How do you regard your discipline at the moment, psychology, in relation to the animal turn and maybe also critical animal studies as well? Because I see your project is there about the history of your discipline to an extent. I suppose when I think of psychological work in this area, I'm also thinking of, I guess, a recent growth in research on coming from sort of social psychology and looking at lots of research around meat consumption and the meat paradox. And there's been quite a lot of UK-based research, actually, hasn't there, around both animal consumption and also veganism and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's sort of interesting maybe just to ask you to reflect on how you think your discipline is responding to the animal turn at this point in time.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. That is a really interesting question. And I've got an ambivalent relationship with my own discipline, but I started teaching a module in psychology of human animal relations about 6-7 years ago. And I suppose the first thing to say is there's lots going on. So lots has changed since then, and I struggle to keep up. And some of the kind of criticism that I made quite easily early on, I'm almost kind of disappointed that I can't make it anymore because things have moved on. And actually, it's more complicated than that. And people are engaging with it a lot more. People who call themselves psychologists. There are always people like Kenneth Shapiro, in fact, who were doing that work, but there are relatively few. So yeah, what's changed? What's the relationship? I still think they've been slow to engage with the kind of philosophy of the animal turn, animal studies, those kind of more critical developments. But there have been pockets. Some of those pockets have been in developing a psychology of human animal relations. That's often still been about attitudes towards animals. So for me, that's problematic still, in that it doesn't see animals as active players in a relationship, even though it's called a psychology of human animal relations. So it's still focused on things like AAT, animal assisted therapy, or animal assisted interventions, without really probing the role of the animal or the life of the animal or the contribution of the animal. And that's still happening a lot, even as a focus on human animal relations kind of exceeds journals into things like mainstream psychology journals. I still think that's problematic often. That said, there's some really fascinating topics that the area called psychology or social psychology seems to be running with, and meat consumption is a really peculiar, fascinating one that I've tracked a lot since the meat paradox idea and some of it since, which is still not really engaging with the post-humanities, say, or multi-species debates that are happening in geography, anthropology, elsewhere that you'll know about, of course, but doing something really interesting and critical in its own right by trying to think about meat eating not just actually as a psychological process, but as this thing bound up with wider cultural, material, social dynamics. So yeah, I think there are those pockets, and increasingly it is animal studies is interdisciplinary in that there is interesting work going on across lots of different disciplines, sometimes called psychology, but still less so than lots of other disciplines. I think in terms of really embracing what I think are these really exciting, challenges to anthropocentrism.
Thanks very much, Matt. Okay, we're at 5:10 UK time. There are some comments in the chat, but I think they're responding to previous comments and previous questions. So feel free, everybody, to read through those comments in the chat. People also expanding upon their comments from before, and also a little bit of self-promotion is entirely accepted. So no need for anybody to apologize for that here. Okay, anybody else? Last chance maybe for anybody to ask a question or make a comment about Matt's talk. Okay, then hopefully then that's everybody, and we can draw this to a close and just really give Matt great thanks for a really interesting talk. I was watching it here with Paula Arcari, and we kept sort of noting things that we didn't know, so we were definitely educated. And yeah, thanks for everybody doing the applause icon. It's not quite the same as being in the face-to-face, but it's the best we can do at this time. And it's I think it's nice to continue the Zoom format in a way, because we can really expand the audience. So all of the rest of the seminar series this year will be also available via Zoom. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for all the fascinating questions. And yeah, the rest of the series look really interesting. I'm going to try and turn up for those too. So yeah, thanks again.
Great. Yeah, just keep an eye on our Twitter feed, for example, for the next, I think registration will open for the April talk within a week or two. Okay, thanks everybody.
All right, cheers everyone. Thank you.